Good evening, Bill.
Hi, Sandy.
I'm really sorry about this evening. Poor Bill has been sitting waiting for me for an hour. Uh,
That is my own fault. Daylight saving time in America shifted. There's a really great Husker Du song called Celebrated Summer. And one of the lines is somewhere near April time, they add another hour. And then, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, they shifted it from April to March. And so now that song makes no sense.
oh, well, that's a really interesting piece of information to start tonight's talk with.
Hey, it's art, music.
So, the sense of other senses, something that really fascinates me how I can go through my life and have such a keen interest in visual art, but actually also really know and understand that when I see something that is very moving to me, it also often is accompanied by another sense somehow that I'm not suggesting for a second that I am synesthetic, for example, but where one sees something, one might also get a very strong evocation of smell or taste or certainly sound. And of course, those connections are well documented in how people see art and appreciate art, and of course, interact with art. Um,
Do you think we overuse our eyes in general or over rely on seeing?
I think that's a really strange thing to say because, as a sighted person, and how lucky we are to be sighted people, I don't know if we overuse it. I think what
Yeah.
would perhaps be another way of saying that or suggesting a similar thing would be that we underuse the other senses in order to
Yeah,
not.
that's exactly what I mean. Yeah,
Yeah, so rather than like blaming sight for being like the loud extrovert one, we could say that actually maybe there is a time and a place and now for other senses to actually merge into also actually the visual arts world. So you laughed when I went through the slides to begin with before we started recording when I brought this one up. Why did you laugh?
I don't. There are pieces that are very memorable that maybe have gotten a lot of press. That you've seen before, um, and I think a lot of Hearst's stuff is in that category. Um, so even if you had never seen it or never experienced it or never really thought about it, other than just a cursory knowledge that this shark in a box exists,
Hmm.
you would still have some sort of sense about it, even if you never really thought about it, just because it's sort of a known thing. I
See,
laugh because I have seen this before, but yeah,
I sort of disagree with that. I have to say that my I was very kind of complacent about the idea of this work. So Hirst's work is really, really accessible, especially in the UK. He's always having shows left, right, and centre, and also he's so commercialized that it's really, really difficult to go anywhere and talk about so-called contemporary art and not have something about Hirst kind of pop up. He's constantly in our media. He's really kind of a
can I
well,
ask a question though? I mean, that is all true, and yes, he is available to anyone. Say, if you wanted to go to the Tate Modern, half the time there's stuff there, whatever. But
yeah.
like, what percentage of the population of London or the UK has ever even been to the Tate Modern? I think not to go off on a giant tangent, but just something to think of in the future. I think even the way that you and I talk about people who look at art, that's still maybe 5% of the population
But Bill, what?
visit museums and things. I'm
Okay.
just I'm just saying that, like, I think we talk about this kind of stuff as if the average person has seen this. It may be that he gets a lot of press, but how many people in the world actually read art press or even read
Well,
Times of London art section?
all I can say is that I'm an ordinary person who just happens to really love art.
Well, you're an ordinary person who's also, teaches art. So that's
Right.
like, I think we are not ordinary people. We're people who make a living thinking about art. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that, yes, it's accessible, but I doubt most people have ever even interacted with anything like this. So
Okay.
just continue. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. But what I am about to say is more that I had a sense of what this piece of work would be like, but I'd never actually seen it in the flesh.
Yep.
And then I was in New York a few years ago. Well, it was before Imogen was born, so probably about 12 years ago with a friend. And we went to the Met, and I turned the corner, and
There it is.
it's here. It was there. And everything that I thought I would know and think and feel about being with this piece of work, or what this piece of work might look like or feel like or be sensed like by me, was completely out the window, and I was totally blown away by it. One, I experienced a profound fear while standing at its mouth, but then I was also the child who would literally propel myself from one end of the swimming pool to the other, thinking that perhaps somehow a shark had got into the municipal swimming pool uh, in Glasgow, you know. So there's a lot of kind of like a suspension of belief, a sense that there's something, well, physical. It's a physical entity. And much as it's dead, and we understand that it's suspended in its formaldehyde box, it's not going anywhere. The sense that it's going somewhere is so striking. The reason why I put it in here as the first slide for talking about the sense of other senses is that for me, it kind of is a collision of most senses. And I think that's to do with an appreciation of like the weight of water, the fear of things in water, fear of sharks. Obviously, that's just so obvious. Um, I was completely stunned by how powerfully I reacted to it.
It's interesting though, because the primary interaction with it still is visual. All those things are true, but those are sort of your imagination of how that water feels, and how, you know, the salt water of the ocean smells and tastes and all of those things. But standing there next to it, it's not like you're tasting salt and feeling the weight of water on top of you.
No, but that's what
So
I
it's
wonder
interesting
about.
how your brain does that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the point of all of these images, really, all of these pieces of artwork, is that our
Yep.
immediate access point is through something that is visual. That's the point of
Yep.
this, isn't it?
Sure.
And somehow all the other senses manage to clatter in. Now, there'll be lots of people who will not feel as I have felt with this. There are lots of people who hate this work, and there are also lots of people who hate Damien Hirst. Um, but for me, and also having seen a lot of his work on display all over the place, I mean, we went to Venice a few years ago, we saw his big exhibit there. You know, lots of it is very interesting. I found this utterly compelling, and it was in part to do with the immediate sense of fear, and then after that, this sense that there was other senses in play when I was looking.
Do you think that, sorry, this might be a little tangent, but I'm just wondering how you feel about it. There are people like Hearst and Koons and others who are sort of the art version of a celebrity chef in some ways.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like where it's as much about their persona as it is their work. It's like it's a PR press thing as much as it is just a pure art thing. Um, do you think that plays into how you react to this work at all?
Well, I think I'm aware that I may be called an absolute sucker for thinking and feeling and sensing the way I have done, and that's okay. I'm aware that Damien Hirst may think that there's some stupid person somewhere who was so transfixed and stunned because isn't everything just such a great big joke? I don't know if that's true.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter to me, because what
Yeah.
is how I have reacted and how I felt about it. And so much as Hirst has got this persona, like his legend is so written with kind of like not sarcasm, but I would say he's probably quite a difficult character. Playful is too nice a word, maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
Uh, but it didn't stop me from feeling. It didn't get in the way of it.
What do you think of the title? I mean, I'm just saying that is a whole other. It's funny because like the emotional feeling of word, words can be a verbal oral thing, they could be a visual thing, but the way that a certain set of combination of words makes you feel is almost like a sixth sense in a lot of ways. And you know, this piece could have been called The Shark or Untitled Number 27,000, but it's not,
Not.
you know. So he must have, or someone, I'm assuming he must have thought that it needed another level. It's almost a little bit of an explanation of what he's trying to do, isn't it?
What
You know,
else should a
like
title do?
I don't know, but I think that in this case, the title is actually in some ways telling you what to feel.
Hmm. I think the
You
title
know,
suggests something also, though, that in itself and of itself is kind of nebulous and unknowable, isn't it? That's the point of it.
yeah. Do you think your reaction to, because you, as I recall, are a swimmer, do you think that changes your view of it too?
I think it heightens the appreciation, the sense appreciation of what it feels like to be in water. But I have
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
come back to this, the fact for the primary sense of this was fear. Now, we're talking about senses mostly in this presentation tonight in terms of, you know, taste and touch and so on. This, as I said, brought all of those things kind of together, and there was not one thing that was isolated. So those sight was my access point. I came around that corner and I saw it there. Everything was in play. And there's actually very few pieces of work really that so carefully manage to prompt that total synthesis of all my senses, even if it is
Sure.
only in my imagination.
It's true. It's one of those pieces that I think from a very superficial level, it feels gimmicky, but that it's more successful in real life. I think the scale of it is part of it.
Well, this is what I'm
Um,
saying, you know, having read about it, being aware of it.
and the fact that you can move around it is also interesting because it's
Yeah.
actually like a sculpture. It's 3D.
The trepidation as one approached that top corner to come towards the open mouth. What a funny woman I am. Honestly, you should have seen me skulking about in the net.
This last summer, I was in Martha's Vineyard, and we went to, my friend and I went to a beach, and there were big giant signs, and it said, you know, there are great white sharks in this water. 4 people have been killed over the last 10 years swimming in this water.
Mm.
You know, I mean, big giant, you know, like straight out of Jaws kind of signs. And I was just like, that is just so strange. It happened to me years before. Somebody had gotten attacked by a shark down in Florida on a beach that I was with my sister, and she wanted to go in the water. And I was like, I didn't really want to go into water for other reasons. I think it was cold or something. So I made the excuse of the shark. And she says, do you know what the odds of getting killed by a shark are? I said, do you know what the odds are if I don't go in the water? But yeah, no, I get it. It's funny though how there's nothing about this that can harm you, and yet your heart was probably elevated, your heart rate.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, sharks too are just so big,
Mm. Well, this
you
one
know,
is.
that yeah, 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 yeah.
So I put this one in because I do want to obviously talk about the senses as we would think of them, uh, in this case, to do with taste,
Yep.
the food bowl. And it's made out of salt. This artwork is made out of salt.
I like the avocado, the salt avocado.
So Ken and Julia Yonetani are very interested in making work that comments on, for example, environmental issues, issues of kind of race, colonialism. The salt, I mean, if we were to not know anything really about these artists, but to know that this work is salt and that its title is Still Life, the Food Bowl, I think we could still approach a pretty strong identity sense of this work, what it could mean. But I do think that work that plays with sensation within the mouth even is sort of extraordinary. It's like imagining salt and vinegar crisps or something very vinegary. And when you really imagine it, saliva fills in your mouth.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of, you ever see those optical brain illusion things where it's like the color red, but it's written in blue type,
Mm.
and it's sort of what color is this? And it'll say red, but be written in blue, and your brain just doesn't compute. So in some ways, it's like, oh no, it's a peach, but that's salt. But wait, it's in the shape of a peach. Um, it's amazing that the tricks your brain. It's like you're bringing two different senses and you know cleaving them apart in a way that your brain doesn't quite understand.
Does that annoy you? Do you feel like I'm
It's
very
discordant.
okay? Because I'm very passive, in terms of just generally quite passive. I don't mind that Hearst might be taking the piss out of me. That doesn't bother me at all because I get what I need from this. And it might not be what I'm supposed to feel, or if it's what I am supposed to feel because Hearst is playing a trick on me to see how dumb I am and believing all his shit, fine,
Yeah.
I still don't care. Whereas, the trickery employed by artists, because we're all invested in some kind of illusion as artists, really, aren't we? I wonder how many people resist the sense that they're being duped in some way. You're being tricked into a kind of duality in this sort of work, aren't you? As you've just suggested, it's like seeing the word red when it's written in blue. Do you resent that trickery?
I don't resent it. I understand what you're saying the artists are trying to do, and the style, the themes at which they try to speak.
Mm.
Um, to me, work like this, you could say the same thing about the Hearst in some ways, where it's like it's either too clever by a half or it's contrived too much. Like
Mm.
there's no, it's almost like it was a solution in search of a problem. Like, oh, I know what we'll do. We'll make food out of inedible stuff to show, the environmental impact of food, or the fact that there's hunger in the world, or you know what I mean? Oh, whatever, their kind of thing is. I look at it, and sometimes, and this is me as somebody who makes art, I find some art to be it makes me roll my eyes a little bit, It's like, okay, I see what you're doing there, artist. Cute.
See, this is what I'm
Um,
talking about. Maybe the word
yeah.
resent is the wrong word. I don't mind feeling stupid in the face of art. Whereas
Well, I don't feel stupid.
I
I
observe
feel
other
like,
people being very self-conscious about giving into what may be then perceived as a kind of, you're stupid to have fallen for it, or, how dumb do you have to be to like invest in this? And your description of like being the eye roller at certain pieces of artwork, I think we're
yeah.
all prone to that at certain times, especially though when we feel that we have to assert our kind of authority or our intelligence over a piece of work. Like, of course I know. But truthfully, Bill, I sometimes think that's uh, maybe uh, okay to be to be duped.
It's not about being duped, and it's not a feeling of like, oh, you got me. It's more of a, oh, I see what you're doing there. I see that there are people who could find that clever. It feels a little trite to me.
I think I'm one of those dumb people who just thinks,
But see,
oh, this is
you're
clever.
putting a judgment on there, right? It's like you're saying that you know um, by you being empathetic to the goal, you're somehow being duped. I don't think that's true, and it could be that the statement they're trying to make is a worthy one,
Mm.
but it's a little bit. I feel sometimes I feel like art changes culture, or society. And then there are some times that I think that art is like racing to catch up to society. And I think sometimes art in this case is, the old art reflecting society. I get that. It's like back and forth. But in some cases it feels like, oh, this is an important thing that's going on right now, so I'm going to make something about it. It feels
Well, I mean, let's
trying
look
to
at the
catch
date,
the wave.
2010, not so long ago, really, only, 11 years
True.
ago. Still, we mustn't forget that really our appreciation and wider understanding of this as a mainstream culture, white Western mainstream culture, has really only truly gotten on board with notions of kind of what I think was full-scale environmentalism and environmental crisis in the last 6 or 7 years. Other things have always come first, and also, frankly, much of mainstream society just hasn't been bothered or invested to care, which
True.
is obviously part of the problem. So when I look at 2010 and I see this work, and I understand that the artists are making a comment on sustainability or the lifespan of food, the duration of food, the ethics, the morality and philosophy of food. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with feeling that this work is actually very, very clever and insightful.
It seems like you're offended by my reaction. Do you take it personally if I find something trite and you don't?
No, I think that also is part of my point. I don't find it offensive. I don't find any of it offensive to me that, as we were saying when we started this part of our conversation, I don't find it offensive at all that I may be being tricked in order for me to feel, think, or sense something. And that's what, the question that I started with, that's taken us on this little detour, which, by the way, is a very interesting detour, is, do you feel resentful when you feel you have been tricked? And then I have raised.
I don't like. The tricked word is the one that I don't necessarily like. I don't find myself tricked. I just see it's a little bit of a. It's like there's really only one big idea here, which is I'm going to use a sort of opposite material to make something of a certain form, and therefore it's going to mean something. That's the big idea is let's make stuff out of salt or sugar and form it into shapes of things that people know.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it is just execution of that idea. I think that idea is like, okay, that's cute, but it's not that deep to me. That doesn't mean that I feel duped or any of those words or tricked, the words you're using. I'm not offended by the fact that they're trying to do it. I just don't think it's all that clever. There are other things that people do that actually are clever. I actually think the Hirst shark is far more clever than this sort of conceit, which is actually a really interesting thing about contemporary art, where I think that in my experience, there's this sort of bifurcation of it's almost like like a clever twist in a book. It's just like, oh, I know what's going to make this interesting. The person in her dream is going to be her father the whole time. Bum, bum, bum. Some M. Night Shyamalan thing, right? I feel like a lot of contemporary artists are looking for that thing in their art that's going to make people go, ooh. And it's happened to me before. I'll have to find how the artist, do you know, have you and I talked about this? I think it's a couple, and they do the piles of trash and they shine the lights through them.
Yeah, it's Noble and Webster.
Yeah. Like that stuff I've experienced in real life and thought it was incredibly clever. And like, okay, yeah, that got me. So, I mean, there are things that are just neat ideas that actually do get me. This one didn't, which is fine. I understand what it's saying. You know what's interesting too? The Vic Muniz, who you didn't like when I brought him up on my other thing a few weeks ago, when I got to drive the show. often does things where he uses materials where he's, painted people in sugar or salt, or, made the army guy out of little army men and then photographed it, or whatever it is.
Mm.
Like, to me, that's like taking some idea and then sort of taking it one or two steps further and saying that is the art.
Yeah, I do wonder about this very specifically about taking senses further. So we may come up
Yep.
upon something through our visual sense, and that's our access. And then we might have a sense stimulated somehow through our imagination, or a connected trigger, a psychological trigger where we have a sense of taste or smell, maybe. But then further still, more that there's almost like an avalanche then of kind of imagination that comes from that, because each of those
Sure.
senses in their own right would trigger something else.
Yeah. And in this case, if you're looking at it and then you think that it's salt because it says that it's salt,
Mm.
it's like, oh God, okay, salt. Ugh, need some water,
Also,
if
I
I
mean,
told you that this was sugar, you'd think very differently about it. You know what I mean? In a very interesting way.
it does make me think, again, the reason why I put this next to the Hearst, it's also about preserving
Oh,
something about,
interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
right. So it's about preserving something, but through the idea or notion of preservation, um, or preserving rather, one would also then have an understanding that there's decay, and of course there's death, and there's something about a putrefaction that's not being allowed to happen here but nonetheless is present. So the extension
Well, it's
of this,
happening. It's just happening much more slowly.
the extension of the sense goes way beyond the limitation of what we see. In so many ways we're actually quite limited by what we see. If we
Yeah.
stayed with the one sense of sight, of vision, what have we got? Maybe that is the point at which we have a pretty picture.
What's wrong with a pretty picture?
Absolutely nothing. But when we're thinking about how something that's visual also then stimulates all these other things, that's when we enter a realm that is so much bigger than the actual art. And that's the bit I find really fascinating. The art is so transporting and can take an individual, a viewer, to a point that is way beyond viewing. I don't think one has to be hugely sensitive to get there either, really. I think perhaps it requires patience.
There's also, especially with something like the shark or the food,
Mm.
yes, there is this sense of preservation, but you're really just slowing down time, right?
Mm.
And even in this, when it comes to something like flesh, it is something, and it might actually, even if it's dead, be fuel for something else, whether it's rotting fruit or whatever. But that eventually it's going to be gone. So it's a little bit of a, use life while you have it kind of thing,
Well,
even in
I
slow
think
motion.
you'd never believe it if anyone's watching this, that we don't do these things scripted, because Bill's just said those fateful words about slowing down time. And of course, here we happen upon Cornelia Parker, Cold Dark Matter, an Exploded View, which is absolutely the point of slowing down time in a way that we preserve a moment so that we can fully appreciate, even if we're not particularly patient, actually, what is happening. And again, in terms of putting this in a presentation about senses, this work is designed to be an exploded view. It is the explosion of a shed. Parker recorded that. She actually detonated explosive devices in a shed in the middle of a field. She meticulously collected every shard, and having triggered photographs around the perimeter of
Put it back
that,
together.
she put it all back together and she suspended it. So this is a Turner Prize piece.
Yeah, that's cool.
the thing that makes it really special is that I get such an incredible sense of silence in it.
Well, you slice time small enough and it is a moment, you know.
But I'm also so interested in how senses that should be one thing actually end up being another. And again, this is like, a sense that takes us from something that's about taste, which it really, that is a vivid thing, into something that's about death or decay. We go from something here that is about time through a moment that we know ought to be deafeningly loud. And yet here we are in this gallery space experiencing it in total silence.
Yeah.
I love it.
No, it's cool. I mean, yeah, it's in this case, it's in many ways the sense of time, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me one second. um, it's funny that you brought this one up. This is very cool. Let me ask you a quick question. Well, actually, wait. Let me tell you a quick story, and then I'll tell you a quick question. Sorry, something stuck in my throat. Okay. Earlier today, a friend of mine has a father who was in the Army and worked for the Air Force, the Army in America, and worked at White Sands Missile Range. You know where that is down in New Mexico? It's where the first atomic bomb blew up, where the Trinity test was in 1945. And in 1985, they created this giant sphere of basically TNT and exploded it because they were doing tests. They couldn't do nuclear tests for reasons. So they basically blew up 4,000 tons of TNT in order to basically mimic a small nuke without breaking any laws. And for some reason, it came across my radar today. And I wrote her and said, next time you talk to your father, ask him if he was there for this test. And she wrote me back and said, I asked him and he said no comment, which I really liked. But in many ways, it was just a big fireball in a sphere, a lot like basically this is, which is just funny how it's like a very similar image to what I had in my head. If the process of making this to you, I love the idea that she actually photographed the shed exploding and used the photographs as reference. That's super cool process stuff.
Yeah.
If she had made this from imagination and not from a real thing, basically just took shards of stuff that was destroyed and hung them and made it look like it was a thing exploding, would that change your view of it?
Maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very cool process thing. I just wondered if it mattered. It's, a lot of what would also be interesting if you had this outside or somewhere where you weren't having a bright light casting shadows on the walls. It almost, in some ways, this piece requires the room that it's in order to complete it.
It does, in the same way that I think, Hirst needs the box, obviously.
Sure. Yeah, this needs it uses it's like the whole room is part of the artwork by the end of it. And it's also like, to your sense argument, it's a sense of volume too. There's a sense of space, which changes. Don't you just want to like sneak in there underneath it and go inside? I would totally want to just like go right underneath and like go stand up inside of it. That would be really cool.
I do find this, as a contrast to Hirst again, very playful.
Yeah.
Even though it's not, I mean, there's obviously incredible violence sort of involved in this, but we don't perhaps appreciate it. And again, as a sense, my sense for this is really about sound. Obviously, I'm looking. You're right, the space in which it's suspended is of vital importance. Also because it's like magic. This is proper magic.
Yeah, that's neat. And I think it works on a level even if you don't end up reading the label. And to me, that's always sort of a defining factor. Most of the time, to me, it's like, if it works without me knowing how it was made or what they're trying to say, and then the label or the title or what have you adds to that or gives you a whole other angle on it, that's fantastic. But it kind of almost has to work without you explaining it to me.
If you were to retitle this one, what would you title it? Based on just seeing it and being with it now.
God, I'm terrible at titling things. I never title anything.
Well,
Putting me on the spot there, Robertson.
I know.
What would you call it?
Probably something like Silence in Motion.
Do you see a bicycle up in the top? Or is that just wheels of like a old wheelbarrow or something?
Yeah, I think it is. Maybe it's maybe a wheelbarrow wheel.
Yeah. I mean, I would be boring and call it explosion or something like that, or
is that boring?
See, T minus 0.002. You know, this is 2 milliseconds after the explosion. I mean, talk about the exact opposite.
Okay, but also, you know, exact opposite. For people watching, I don't just randomly pick images out of the air.
You don't?
No. There is method to the order.
To your madness?
The link for me was about death, preservation, and taking the sense beyond the senses, right? To here to here.
Okay.
And from here to here, it was about time. And now it's about silence.
Yeah, this is why you're a good teacher, right? Lesson plan design.
I don't know.
What do you like about this?
Well, last time when we were talking about the right to photograph, we talked about Donna Ferrato. And I said the first time I'd ever seen her work was in the big Phaidon press, the photo book, which is like the big index book that I was given when I was a teenager. And that's also the place where I first saw this. And it was this photograph. There are many photographs you can see of Luigi Ghirri's work. He's probably one of the most famous Italian photographers, second part of the 20th century. He's an Italian aestheticist. But this photograph, titled Capri, I had never really seen something that somehow managed to embody silence quite like this. Now, maybe it's obvious because it's very serene, it's very calm, it's very muted. But there's also
lots of negative space all over the place.
There's also something so surreal about it. You know,
it feels very flat and three-dimensional simultaneously.
Yeah, so there's something very kind of painterly and Shiriko-esque in this. But there's also a kind of Sugimoto disappearing out into that ocean.
Sure.
And so everything about this plays with and piques my sense of sense. And I think the title, we've talked about titles already, Capri, beautiful place, fragrant island. And though we can't see a lemon grove or any kind of blossom or bloom, I can smell the sea and I can smell these incredible fragrances. I can feel something that is not hot, but is soothing. The air is soothing. So anyway, when I saw this photograph, I spent such a long time looking at it. Now, I know that is perhaps actually where I am a bit different, and I can spend honestly hours looking at a photograph like this, and I don't think that's strange to me. That is kind of meditative and affirming. But I do get a kind of multi-sense from this photograph. And I lead into it through, yes, sight as usual, but also an appreciation of silence.
So interesting. You and I are such very different people in a lot of ways. I look at this image and all I can see is that ring hanging on the wall.
Yes. Does it annoy you? Does the ring annoy you?
I do find it distracting, yes.
Do you?
Yes.
Mm.
Because the scale of it is different than anything else in the picture. Now, it may be that it's distracting in a good way, and you know what I mean, that it's, if it didn't have it, there's a lot of images that I've seen that I think you and I have talked about where, you know, change one little thing and it doesn't work. It may be that that's the thing that you can't change that makes it work.
Yeah, I think, you know, if it wasn't there, this would become almost so nothing that it would be nothing.
Yeah.
Just tip it over into that purchase I have on some kind of reality takes it away from it being a Deshirico painting and moves it into this other photographic realm. I really, I'm not surprised that you don't know this photographer, even though he's so, you know, should be such a well-known photographer. But he died tragically young. He died, I think, in 92. He was only 49. He had a heart attack. And he was at the height of his career. And so that career was cut short. But if you look him up and you look at all the photographs he made, not many are quite as serene as this one. He photographed at Versailles, but he photographed mainly in, I can't remember the name of the region in Italy, but spent a lot of time photographing kind of landscape, human landscape, and applying this lovely color, the wash of color that speaks of quiet, reflection, sometimes heat.
The color inside the archway is what really gets me.
This photograph is one of those images also as a color image. It's very, very difficult for me to show you in all honesty as a truthful color take on what actually the image looks like. Because if you look for Capri and you see all the different uploads of it on Google, each one is a totally different color cast.
This is one of the advantages, by the way, of digital photography. You know, like unless somebody messes with the image, if I upload an image and it's some picture that I took, unless somebody messes with that, it's going to be the same no matter when it's, you know, like I mean, within a certain degree with of monitors and all the rest of it, but it's not like each variation of it is going to be completely shifted color wise. Do you think that a photograph like this, and I'm not saying this to take anything away from this, and this photograph is from 40 years ago, that a photograph like this, if made by a fine art photographer now, would be far more dismissed because of things like that? A photograph like this would get lost in the trillions of pictures that get taken every year now.
Well, we've kind of touched on this before. You know, it's like,
yeah, but it's this kind of image that I think is very susceptible to that.
Well, yes, and also as you've mentioned before, street photography.
Yeah.
You know, just kind of gets lost, some of it, unless it really is exceptional.
Yeah.
I think this is exceptional. And by the way, also the other thing I want to mention about it is, for me, there is a sense of touch, and that's to do with the contrast of textures, even though again it's very subtle. And you've got an Eliasson installation sculpture coming up that I would have put next to this, but you'll see what's coming next anyway in a minute. But the touch factor in this, that smoothness, the wall is so smooth, that hollowed space within the negative area, and then that wash out into the sea is all so smooth. And then you have the stone, the sense of weightedness, a sense also, again, of time because of the stone, like how long has it been there? I think our imaginations are extraordinary.
Especially if it's something we've already experienced. Like I could imagine the sort of marble tile looking of that flat surface, you know, out through that opening. You could almost imagine what that feels like, just like this smooth sort of wet feel of marble that marble has, you know.
Touch is really interesting as well, I think, for photographers.
Yeah.
You know, we
I
we
think, go
we
ahead.
don't perhaps deal with touch.
I think that it's one of the reasons why when people talk about even just, resolutions of cameras and why you shoot large format and those things,
Mm,
I think that there's a texture that gets smeared when you don't have enough information representing it, that
yeah.
if you do have enough representation, I think that there's a visceral thing of, oh, that's what that person's skin would actually look and feel like if I was there, or the surface of a wall or what have you. That that
I wonder
that
if
is
the
part of the reason why
last.
you bothered with it. Yeah.
I wonder if it's like the last part of the language disconnect between painting and photography is touch.
Could be. Although, when you go see, some Van Gogh painting or something, and you want to, like, touch the texture of the impasto, right? Like, you look at it and you go, God, I wonder what that feels like.
Yeah.
There's even that element of even straight painting a lot of times, that even if you can see it, you don't, for most famous things, you don't actually get to ever touch them.
Well,
Um,
funnily enough, so it's a really amazing. I'd love for people to look this up. If I remember to, I'll put it in the description as a link. A really, really excellent project that was run in collaboration with Tate, and there were images taken out of the Tate archive, and it was an award-winning, I think, a trio of artists or designers who made the Tate pieces. I think um, including kind of like old masters paintings into things that were touchable.
they
So
did like
that,
3D renders of them so you could actually touch the thing instead of the real one.
yeah, and also for people who are visually impaired.
Sure.
I think about this a lot. You know, one of the reasons why I put this together tonight is because I was looking through the Black Book of Colors, which is one of my most favorite books, and Imogen and I pore over it. And it's a book about a little boy who's visually impaired and about how color is expressed to him. And the book is printed with text, but it's also printed in Braille. And the images of the descriptions of color are written as descriptions, but then they're also created as textured elements within the page. And when I think about, you know, you said earlier about, do we overuse sight? How enormously privileged we are to be sighted. Um, but as a little girl, I remember finding out and reading about Helen Keller, being absolutely awestruck by the sense that there was this world of complete silence and
Darkness.
darkness, and yet still, I think I sent it to you about her feeling her way through Beethoven's
Hmm.
Ninth Symphony. Did I send that to you?
I don't think so.
It was just it's so kind of amazing, like taking everything we understand or think we understand as these privileged, able so-called bodied people who have all our sense faculties in order, and thinking about, if we were to remove just one of them, how utterly devastating it would be having had access to them and used them, but also that there's a real people perhaps who cannot share in vision in the way you or I can speak and share in vision doesn't mean that vision is unavailable to them. In some way, they might need to use another sense to get
Well,
it.
you're translating it, yeah.
Uh,
My niece is blind, and it's really interesting because, like, we'll go places, especially when she was little. She'd be 3, 4 years old, and she'd be crawling, and she'd be going on the ground. She'd be hitting the ground
mm,
because she was using basically echolocation.
mhm.
She heard the space by the sounds that got bounced back into her ears by her slapping the floor. And it's just really interesting. It's like, wow, okay, so Agnes is perceiving this space in a completely different way. Not too long ago, I was at the Met, and in the big open atrium area with the Egyptian temple, all the way on the north end. There's actually, if you go around the other side, usually you can't touch any of the stuff. Obviously, you're going to do damage to it, but they actually have a Egyptian sarcophagus with all kinds of little intricate um, hieroglyphics all over it.
Mm,
And if you are, sight impaired, you're allowed to touch it.
mm,
And it's just really interesting. I mean, it just feels completely different, right? I mean, like this is and it's the kind of thing that, I don't know that I would have thought of as much without having somebody in my family
mm,
who can't see. So yeah, no, I get it. I mean, you even think about this. If you were in this place, you said the smell, you
mm,
can also imagine sound of seagulls or the wind or the
mm,
waves crashing down below. Like you can imagine, I've been to places like this. I haven't been here, but I've been places like this. So in my mind's eye, I can imagine it. If you grew up in the desert, if the American desert, and you said, what does it feel like to be on the coast of on the water in Italy? And I'd never seen the ocean or anything like that. I
mm.
wonder what that sense would be.
Yeah, this is where, how rich is this area of, we can imagine in a lazy way because we hang our hat on memory. But if we didn't have a memory, do we still have the sense of it? Because does our
Well, we certainly wouldn't
imagination?
have the same sense of it.
No, but also, the capacity for the senses without the operation or the function of the imagination. I wonder what that is.
Well, even so, by the same sense of it, I mean, you and I maybe have both been to areas like this in Italy, so we can both have the same common feeling of what it would probably be like to stand there. If
Mm,
neither of us had, our imaginations are not necessarily going to meet up like our sense memory would be. But then again, is also interesting because, you're taking some memory and then sort of synthesizing something out of it,
mm.
how you imagine it would feel. Maybe it feels nothing like that. Maybe it's really loud and there's a highway right outside of that little area, right? You have no idea what it's really like there. Um, we
Well,
believe, I think we have this fantasy of what it is.
so of course, not not just a random selection. How nicely we have arrived at a sense of how memory informs sense, because obviously we don't have a memory of what this means. This, oh, I forgot to turn my dishwasher off, everybody, just in case you're wondering what the strange gurgling is in the background. We don't have a memory of this. So I wonder when we enter a space like this, even with using a visual sense, what kind of goes on within us. And of course, Kusama is really, really very good at prompting this, you know, relationship between a viewer as a participator or a participant within a work that somehow moves away from and toward the the experiencer. I actually sometimes, I think thinking about audience and art, Kusama's work is it. I don't feel it's just audience. I feel it's not just viewer. I feel it's experiencer. In terms of like a language descriptor of what is happening actually in all these pieces, I would say that I'm an experiencer. I'm definitely an experiencer. Would you say that
Wait,
you're
is
an
that, do you
experiencer?
somehow think that you don't experience in the same way with sight?
No, what I'm kind of coming up upon now, and it's not something I've really thought about too much before, is whether whether we experience afresh without something else to remember, without some other sense connecting us
Sure.
into like the matrix of understanding.
Can I go philosophical for a second on this one?
Yes, please, Bill. Yes, please.
She's
Don't
like,
leave me
finally.
hanging here by myself.
I think that you could make a case. This is going to get way more woo-woo than I would ever normally go.
Excellent. I love it.
You could make a case that there's primordial universe sort of echo in
Mm.
all of us. And that I think being in a place like this would sort of push that button.
Mm.
This idea where it's like new sparking, like it says, brilliance of life, like the idea of origin.
Yeah.
And I mean, star fields in a non-lit world, you know what I mean? Like when it was like, you ever been out in like the high desert and actually seen, crazy star fields with like the Milky Way and the whole thing, if you're out on the ocean or whatever. I mean, it's mind blowing.
I remember. I
And
mean, I
I think,
remember lying on the deck of a sailboat in the far north, and seeing the stars and then also the light,
Aurora Borealis.
and finding it, you know, I think our archetypal selves are much more responsible for many of our sense appreciations than we like to give it credit for. And
Well,
actually,
go
even
you could go back to the first one and highlight that.
yeah, exactly. But also,
You know,
even something like this, and this comes back to this sense that you and I have both been to places that could be very similar to this, and therefore we're lazy in imagination with this image. We might be lazy in imagination with this image almost.
yeah.
But nonetheless, I think that had I not been to somewhere like this, there's still something about it that reaches some part that is not just about memory to
But
stimulate the
could
senses.
but couldn't you go to the last one and say that in some ways, because none of us have any good experience to explain this,
Mm.
that you might argue that we would all have a more similar experience of it?
Well,
Like we're all on the same footing.
not really, because the only thing I can kind of liken this to, in one way, is I think we've spoken before about um, Anthony Gormley's room filled with white fog. You can't see anything; it's just white
Sure.
and light. And the different ways that people reacted to that were quite astonishing, and the violence with which people reacted to that in terms of their feeling
Yeah, that
was
would
also,
freak me out.
yeah, the people were really freaked out by that. And then when there were other people who were kind of standing completely still and transfixed by it.
Those are the kind of people who fall asleep during yoga sessions.
Yes, thanks, Bill. Um, this is the same thing. I think some people would find this quite troubling. I think
Sure.
Kusama's body of work often is quite troubling. The rhythmic madness of it, as we know, she's well documented it as an individual who is embracing, I guess, a kind of madness. That's a very unfashionable word to use, but mm,
I think anything that is sort of endless, whether it is nothingness of fog or stuff being just endlessly out of focus, or
mm.
light sources that go on forever like this,
So when we
there's a
encounter the
creepiness to it.
okay, so when we encounter the unusual, are we so frightened by it that we don't want to engage our senses? It's like a child who's frightened closes
Wants to
their
run the other
eyes.
way. Yeah.
You know, isn't it funny, the ostrich in the sand moment? It's
Well,
like
you don't want to fall into it. You don't want to get lost.
we feel afraid and we close our eyes.
Sure.
But in not recognizing, I don't think there always is fear. There could also, of course, be curiosity. Could there not?
Sure, but only if you feel like you're safe. I think the fear actually comes from a deep-seated fear of survival, or lack
Mm.
of, that you're scared that you're going to fall into this. You're scared that you're never going to get out of that fog. You're scared of, there's like this panic that
Mm.
sets in. And
So what
I
you're
think that's perfectly
describing,
human, you know.
what you're describing is the feeling and sensation I had when I looked at Hirst's work.
Well, hold on a second. What if you could argue that filled with the brilliance of life isn't a comment of the room, it's a comment of the feeling you get by being in the room?
Then is that the artist giving back the authority to the experiencer and acknowledging that a viewer is an experiencer?
Or is it like the Hearst, the artist telling me what I'm supposed to feel while I'm looking at the piece?
Is the artist telling you what to feel?
Not in that one.
Really?
Well, I guess they all are in some
Yes,
way,
they all
but
are.
the title in this case is what I'm talking about.
Hmm. Yes, the
I
title.
my
Yes,
favorite is the
the
Sandi.
title. Yes, the title. Yes, the title. Just saying, Bill.
Yes, but the other ones are nouns. You know what I mean? It's like this is that place. This is a still life of food. You know, this is the experience of a shark and the fear of the whatever. I forget exactly what the words are. Um, you know, this is a mirrored room filled with the brilliance of life. If it was just say infinity mirrored room, that would be very different.
Mm.
The filled with the brilliance of life is a leading question.
Would you feel afraid in this space?
Depends what kind of mood I was in, but yeah, maybe.
Would you shut your eyes?
No, but I would move around to try to understand where I am inside of it.
So you would try and orientate yourself
Yeah.
spatially, yeah.
I mean, but then again, you know, I had a terrible attack of vertigo last July, which really messed me up for 2 days. So my equilibrium ain't great. All right, how do these two connect?
Well, thinking about the title, just like Drops in Time, Nothing. Filled with the brilliance of life, drops in time, nothing, timeless. Continuity of timelessness is no continuity at all. But I mean, this is spices. This is earthy. This is very physical. Um,
I like the idea of spices. I like the idea of smell. The
mm.
shapes that this thing makes freak me out.
Okay, so then there's the other thing, which is the visual connection purely this sense that there's kind of dots, spots, drops, a room laden, a space taken over, um, not to infinity, obviously, but
Yeah.
nonetheless kind of dense. There's also a relationship for me
The-
with this.
oh,
Um,
interesting. I see those totally. See, I see the Parker one as completely inorganic. Go forward. The spices one is organic in a weird spore kind of way that freaks me out.
oh yeah,
It's like
there's a kind
it's
of
like a Honey
spore
I Shrunk
element
the
to it.
Kid. It's like a Honey I Shrunk the Kid kind of thing.
Yeah, playful.
Creepy.
I think also, you know, the fact that those spices are like weighted down, where we have like almost like the lightness of being, we
Yeah.
have this like,
Well, it's like the spices are making footprints.
yeah, I mean, they stain, they become
Well, plus, I
overwhelmingly
mean,
pungent, and
don't
then
even get into, you know, the history of spices in this world.
well, that's why there's a connection between all of them, Bill. You know, what do these things represent? They are loaded. They are part of their own loaded language. You know, what does salt and sugar mean? What do spices mean? Where do they come from? I mean, Ernesto Neto is a Brazilian artist. He's part of like a kind of, I guess, like a new wave of Brazilian artists who moved away from that very concrete, brutal, not just architecture but art, visual art, that kind of dominated Brazilian
Yeah.
artistic output for
I am
decades.
a brutalist architecture fan, though, overall.
Well, so am I, but it doesn't mean that there can't be this yielding
No, absolutely.
organic nature emerging.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you could totally see that as especially as a, reaction to literally the literally concrete elements of brutalist architecture. But yeah, it's also interesting because there's different spices and colors and weights to all of this.
Yeah. And also,
Viscerally, though, this one is weird to me. But go ahead. Sorry to cut you off.
no, it's just that, again, about this link. An archetypal self doesn't remember why this should be in any way familiar, and perhaps it's not. But there may also be a sense that we somehow still belong within this vast space. And although this is so much more closed down, of course, the fact is that we do belong to an epic landscape and language that is brought to us in a very physical way by humble forms, and well, there are so many things about this. Our memories are triggered by the simplest of things. Our archetypes are nourished or brought to the surface by any number of events or visions or whatever it is.
Well, also in this case, the cultural implications of different spices. If there's curry and you're from a place that uses a lot of curry, or not from a place that uses a lot of curry, you're going to see it completely differently. You're going to react completely differently.
Also the smell, we can't do the smell for people listening to us talking or watching us.
I mean, don't they say smells are the biggest memory trigger, right, of all the senses?
Okay, so we know that in in stores they pipe smell in to enhance a sense of whatever the store wants to sell you.
Yeah.
In the same way that you were always told, if you're trying to sell your house, bake a loaf of bread.
It's cookies in America, but yes.
Of course. I think all of these are connected.
Of course they are.
It's not just about the basic sense of smell and taste and touch and sight and sound. It's about the thing that runs through all of us, which you identify this primordial, archetypal, something that is beyond our memory, and that is, I think, where I really would like to, for myself, to go away and reflect more on. It's this sense of going beyond our memory in order to somehow have a sense of something with those senses in engaged senses. When I can't remember, I don't know what the taste or smell is of many of these spices, perhaps. But nonetheless, do I still get an overwhelming sense of something? Actually, funnily enough, with this one, I don't get an overwhelming sense of anything other than smell, really. I understand story and narrative, but I think that's almost separate to the pure appreciation of sense. Like a story or a narrative is something that is constructed, whereas I think in so many ways senses are reductive, or they bring us back into the small space within ourselves, our inner world somehow, through our external appreciation or sense, of course, of what we encounter. Bill, are you still alive?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what it would be like to install and remove this piece.
I think this one's in a gallery in New South Wales somewhere. And it was in part of a show that moved around Australia and then New Zealand, I think. It's a very well documented piece of work or body of work, and there are many iterations of it. Okay, so
meteorite.
Yep.
By the way, there's a handful of places in the world where you can actually touch moon rocks. It's very cool. One of them is the Smithsonian in DC. So if you're ever down there, go touch a moon rock. Is this one of those like ultimate found art objects?
I think peel the onion back a little bit more, Bill. Come on.
I mean, this goes to the primordial stuff too,
Mm-hmm.
and the sense of time.
You know, there's lots of, I mean, Eliasson is not like Hirst, but he is an excellent publicist. There's lots of information about him. There's lots of his work available. He has a brilliant relationship here in the UK with Tate, for example. So his work is featured frequently. He's also known for really epic pieces. And I have to say, you know, I actually could have chosen so many different pieces from his studio for this. Not necessarily about touch, but just generally about senses and dealing with ideas of sense, memory, and experience. Also, because one of the most beautiful pieces of work I've ever experienced was in the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern, where the giant sun sets and rises.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You know, very kind of like a profound thing to experience. So I'm not sure about experiencing this, but what I do know obviously is that, again, we're in the realm of time, and touch is its title, and of course for illustrative purposes, and also because he's quite lovely looking, we've got a person touching. But I wonder about the stimulation of a sense with this. You know, it's fascinating, and again, this is the link between this one and this one, is that though they are really kind of explicit about the sense that ought to be stimulated, I wonder about the senses that lie in behind that first layer, or indeed if there is anything else to them.
Does there need to be anything else to them?
No, but I think
sometimes the sort of more fundamental and simple things are the more powerful they can be.
I mean, we're in the presence of an object that is ancient.
Yeah, older than the earth, probably. Yeah.
Beyond our ken, its ancientness. And again, that links us right back really to that Hirst piece of work. It's like it's beyond our mind to appreciate the age of this. It's beyond our mind to understand the depth of it. It's beyond our mind to go there, and yet still we have a sense of it.
I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, even that sense of time you're talking about is in many ways an illusion, right? I mean, our human brains cannot comprehend billions of years. Just like it doesn't make any sense. Like we can say billions, you know, we could say exobytes, we could whatever, but we have no sense of those numbers in reality.
So we again, we'll go back to titles. If we were to retitle this, if we were to take a leaf out of Hirst's book, would this be the impossibility of time in the mind of a human or of someone?
Sure. Yeah, that could work. But at the same time, it's also interesting that the title of this is actually an invitation as well. It'd be really ironic though if the title was touch and then there was a thing in front of it that said do not touch.
Don't touch. I don't know actually if you're allowed to approach this, but you're not allowed to touch it.
Do you think that do you see artists as heroes in the same way that sports fans see great players of sports as heroes?
Not always. I will admit now that Don McCullin is a hero for me.
Yeah.
And that's more to do with like the myth and legend of the man, I suppose. And having met him, I became this unbelievably embarrassing human. Oh, so embarrassing. Um, yeah, I don't normally think of artists as heroes. I do think it is a noble cause, though, to bring something to others and share it with them. I mean, I've talked a lot on interviews with other artists about this idea of a generosity within art. Too often art is dismissed as elitist, and I think there are many people like you're describing us as like a 5% minority of people who actually give a shit about this stuff. But actually, there's something expansive. Obviously, people are trying to communicate something. There's a
Sure.
generosity of wanting to share either who one is or what one thinks, feels, sees, or understands in their own navigation of the world through art. And that's why also all of these pieces, um, I wonder still, we've talked so much about our own appreciation of sense. You know, we haven't actually given much time back really to the appreciation of sense for each of these artists. They're sharing with us something that is important enough for them to create these pieces and significant enough to them in order of their senses, and in some cases very explicitly, about how that teaches us or guides us, how it stimulates us or impassions us. And all of that is relevant and valid in and of itself, I would say.
Sure. I mean, just even the experience of making any of these things,
Mm,
even the experience of having the idea to make any of these things. But,
mm,
but in some ways, all of that is part of the word art and doesn't need to be separated from it. I think in some ways, like, yeah, that's what it is. In the same way that, somebody driving experiences the feel of the road. Well, of course they do. They're driving. um, so, I mean, it's like that comes for free in some ways. That's the whole game.
mm.
Um,
So
but
here
yeah,
we are at the end, and you
with a
know,
good looking guy in a cozy sweater.
yeah, but we're also back at the beginning, really, because I would say that we could loop this presentation back on itself, and I would arrive back at the Hearst from here.
Sure.
Um, I would think very carefully, and I will think very carefully now. I'll go in, really consider this about the relationship between me and time that I don't actually have the capacity to understand. And so Hearst's title, much as people love to hate him, my goodness, he's a clever person.
Yes, and a good marketer.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill Wadman.
As always, fantastic and fun to talk to you.
As always, fantastic and fun to talk to you. And I'll see you next time.
Oh, actually, we won't see you next week though. It's going to be 2 weeks. So, because I'm going to
You're
be
busy.
working next week.
And you're very fancy.
Yes, very fancy. You know me.
Thank you, Bill Wadman.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.